Welcome to Summit Financial and Raymond James webinar, Smart Strategies for Navigating College Costs, the 2025 edition. We are looking forward to hosting a webinar, an educational resource, both here for our live attendees, as well as a resource to be made available to folks as a recording to refer back to in the future. So a couple of notes before we get started. It is April 2025, and the rules and laws do change and shift over time. So please make sure to check in with an advisor after reviewing this recording. If it is even 90 days in the future, the world of education and expenses can change quickly. As your host for our panel discussion today, my name is John O'Day. I am a financial advisor here with Summit Financial based in San Ramon, California. I've had a securities license for nearly 20 years and here at Summit Financial for over a decade, working hard here at Summit Financial to play a positive role enriching the lives of our clients and friends and family and community. And we're looking forward to building an educational resource here for our friends and family around financing the cost of college is an important aspect. I have joining me today one of my friends and an incredibly valuable resource to me and my clients, Jen Lee. Jen, would you like to introduce yourself to our community?
Sure. So my name is Jen Lee. I am a lawyer. Please don't run away screaming when I say that. I am a lawyer and I'm primarily a debt and credit lawyer. And a lot of that goes into student loans and college financing. And I also have Bernadette with me, and she's the elephant in the room. And that's more people than not have financial issues and navigating all of those different financial things. John's an expert at, and I am an expert on the financial stress side. You don't want to talk to me, you want to talk to John. So, but I am a lawyer. I am licensed in California and North Dakota, and I do a lot of debt, credit, bankruptcy, tax type of work. So thank you, John.
That's a super great intro and transition as for our community as we work with our clients to build financial plans and projections over time on what goals and objectives they want to accomplish, what resources they have available to accomplish those goals. As we think in big order of priority, financial security, retirement is a big one. Most of us are going to need a boatload of resources to get to a point where work becomes voluntary. Housing, a big question. How do we fund the ability to afford purchasing a home? A close third is, hey, I've created these humans. I'd like to launch them into the best possible life that they can experience. And for many of us, the college track has been pounded into us as the single most important thing that we as parents can equip our kids with to have the best life possible and however you want to define it. And as we build these financial plans and talk about these things, Jen and I have had the pleasure of collaborating when things don't go well. And we wish we could take our debts and liabilities and surprises and scrape them into a big pile and burn them and really get our friend Bernadette there going. I was surprised at how common a college-related expense or liability or loan or problem comes up in this conversation. So I thought it would be powerful and interesting to talk about college financing, not in terms of saving your way to get there, but sometimes the process of maybe able is it smart or helpful to leverage or borrow money? We borrow money to buy houses. Is that any better or different when we think about in an investment like an education? And is this different? Is this important? And the expense of college has increased so rapidly, even in the 20 years that I've been practicing, and Jen, I know you've seen the same. I was just pulling up the numbers today. Functionally, for in-state tuition at UC Berkeley, just up the street here, is going to run a little over $50,000 a year, tuition, housing, food. If you participate in the medical plan through the university, $50,000 a year times 4, even if you can get in, that's $200,000. A family is voluntarily choosing to part with about $1 million of retirement assets to launch and support a kid if they're fully funding that cost. That's just it's a huge trade-off, and it comes with some negatives and some risks associated with it. And most parents are just taken through the financing process with very little in terms of training and education. So as we back into this, We're really hoping to arm ourselves with, yes, college is going to be expensive. And for many of us, we won't have the resources saved enough to cover the whole thing. What are my options? And it is very common that the educational institutions will just say, oh, there's plenty of financing options. And unfortunately, it is true. There are plenty of financing options and they're not all the same. And thinking through that, I think, is our goal today. So we're going to spend a little under an hour. We're going to try to touch on some important agenda topics, such as these financing tools, the big surprises, and some of the things there. But Jen, from your perspective, as you're thinking about education, both as an attorney that deals with debt issues, bankruptcy, and a parent, right? Some of this mixes together. How do you think about education as a goal and the tools available to fund that expense?
Education is an important tool, I think, but I also agree with you. So as I was nodding, I felt like a bobblehead, everything John was saying. Like this is all legit. John's legit. I think education is an important tool. However, there is an emphasis on only one way to get there a lot of times, and that's to go to the highest ranked school or the top tier. And I'm seeing a lot of people these days who are interested in trades. Your plumber's making a lot of money these days because it's not something everyone can do. And so I think taking like a worldview perspective on education and maybe not pushing an 18-year-old to go to a $50,000 a year school when they probably will change their mind 17 times of what they want to do. Looking at it from like an investment perspective is how I tend to look at education. I am not a huge fan of college. I have a degree unwillingly. I have 3 degrees unwillingly.
Right.
But I think a lot of what gets pushed, and especially these days with kids being overscheduled and really like you have to have a 4.8 GPA to get into some of these schools, and that environment may not be the best only way to do things. And so that's how I tend to look at education. And then from the debt attorney side of things, a lot of what I wish people did was talk to their financial advisors many, many years before their kids got to college.
Sure.
Because there are only so many things you can do once you get to that point. And I found so many.
Yeah, you've got a sophomore, junior, senior in college.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot you can do at that point, that you have the resources you have, that you have the
Yeah.
cash flow that you have. And you may have been yourself communicating and setting expectations and really trying to encourage your kid towards an educational path. And we're sort of down to, we have what we have.
Yes. And when John said that there's plenty of financing available and they hand you a packet and they say sign on the dotted line, and you're like, oh, this is great. They're giving me a $50,000 parent plus loan or something like that. A lot of people don't understand what that means for their own retirement. And the sandwich generation is a big thing these days. That
Sure.
Middle 45 to 65 range where you're taking care of elderly parents and also trying to pay back your own student loans and now your kids' student loans.
Right.
Take care of yourself first. Make sure your retirement is set up because there's only so many things you can borrow for retirement versus education. So that's how I tend to look at it, as being very proactive. And
Good backdrop. We've touched on a couple of important topics. Given that this resource tends to be for those folks, I got a high school age kid, I'm really pointed at college, I think this is going to work, but I really want to start to zero in on, at this point, given where we are, take me through some of the tools and resources that are available. You touched on, in our example, there's plenty of financing options, but all of them are not created equal. Do you want to at least give us sort of a high-level overview of the different bucket types of financing? Because I think that's the hardest thing. Even I, as a parent, when my two, one still in, one graduating, when I got my cost packet from the institution, they included in there financial assistance. And I'm a professional who's paid to provide financial advice. I had to ask them, what is that? Oh,
yep.
that's you borrowing money. Oh, that's not financial assistance. You need to call that debt.
Mm-hmm.
So can you take us through sort of at a high level? It seems like there's bucket types of financing tools that are available to parents and students at this point?
There are a lot of buckets, but we'll go through them. And I would like to point out that the schools buckets are not always all inclusive. They're going to give you the easiest thing for them. So when we talk about these buckets, I'll try to break down which ones the school will present to you, which ones won't. But on the alternative funding strategy side, there's the scholarships and grants. So those are not things that have to be repaid. Sometimes they come from the school, and sometimes they are an external program of some sort, like a national merit scholarship or
So this is a place to get cash for as a
yes,
reward or a component. This is not something that needs to be repaid.
exactly.
Okay.
And if your kid's interested in something very specific, there are some schools out there that specialize in those specific things, and they will often offer significant scholarships and grants for those programs. And so
One bucket
sometimes,
type, alternative funding
yep,
solution. So in here we would put scholarships, grants, what and narrower the focus, the more unique the situation, the more unique the family, the community, wherever you're coming from, there may be a very long list of potential options and it's really just the effort, right? That take
yep,
on the role of a job. Your job is to try to sort through and apply to scholarships, grants, and other tools in this alternative bucket.
exactly. Yeah.
Would we
And
put in here some of the other things like, you know, I didn't, my kids didn't work, but I worked. Like, I'm not sure how that turned out. How did they get a better deal than I did? Work study programs, part-time. I
yep.
mean, what else would you put in there?
Yeah. So in the alternative funding side, I would put work study. I did work study in undergrad. And so it was an amount of money that went towards my tuition, reducing the cost. And then there's part-time jobs as well. Now, it depends on the student, and some people just want their kid to study and not work. I had been working since I was 14, and so I
I'm
did
really good at making pizza and
this
delivering
whole
it, by the
thing.
way.
Yes. And then I would also put in that alternative funding, and you may disagree with me, but I would also put in there community college for some of the general things that, like, the first 2 years is an alternative funding source because it's a lot
Sure.
cheaper.
I mean, from your perspective, community college is a substantial discount from four-year accredited uh, colleges and universities, yes?
Yes, yes, it's uh, maybe $1,000 a semester versus $25,000 a semester. It's a huge savings
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of things.
In the lives of quite a few of my clients, that junior college route is a college a block up from the regular university. So I'm not sure there's a loss in, the feel or the college life associated with that. You're still going through with a cohort that is typically pointed that direction.
Yeah.
Um, Excellent. So super helpful. Thank you. So alternative bucket, scholarship, grant, work study, part-time, tuition reimbursement programs. What is that as a topic?
Yeah, that was my next one, was the tuition reimbursement program. So this may not be for someone who's just 18, but maybe your employer does have tuition reimbursement for employees and their children. That could be an interesting benefit. But some programs do, or some employers do have tuition reimbursement programs. There is also a trend to do tuition reimbursement or loan repayment for people who graduate and then have loans to repay afterwards. So there's some like hybrid things in there.
Okay.
But tuition reimbursement tends to be an employer or some kind of benefit through a job.
As we point towards the debt options, right? Because some of these are going to run out and not everybody's going to qualify for the special grant that's only, available to people with long noses or, can hop on one foot for an hour or whatever the unique feature is. Would you put, you know, non-college based debt options like adding a home equity line or other things in this bucket?
I probably wouldn't necessarily put it into alternative funding, but I would put it into a debt option that may be, depending on the situation, more or less preferable over some of the other ones. But
Okay, well, then
yes,
we should get into some of the other ones
it
because
is a debt.
yeah, the home equity line comes up in some of these conversations. And it has its own issues, right? It's collateral against your home. It's another piece of debt. You have to be careful and check with your tax advisor on the deductibility associated with the home equity line of credit, and things like that. So we have alternative. So let's talk about the debt-based tools. We touched on HELOC, but the college-specific debt-based tools, again, seems like there's a dizzying array of special terms or considerations or what you call them, or there's the
Yes.
college debt crisis. And, take me through sort of in this universe, what are our tools and resources, and how do we tell them apart?
Yeah, there's a lot of different debt options. I mean, of course, debt's a big money maker for lenders too. And so that's why there's so many options out there. The first line item you'll usually see is federal loans for the student. And
Okay.
so the student is able to take on federal student loans for right now, anyway. That, again, as John said, check when at your current status when you're looking at this. But federal student loans are usually the first line item. The problem with federal student loans for the student is that they're very limited in the amount of money they'll let them borrow for good reason. I agree they should be limited, but they
Yeah.
don't cover nearly the cost of attendance.
Okay. So
Yeah.
like this is the borrower, it would be my son Joe rather than me. My son Joe is 21. He's probably not that credit worthy, so they're not going to loan him a lot.
Right. And they don't even check credit for federal student loans for the students. They're
Okay.
just going like there's a cap on them. It's like $5,500 for first year undergraduate to our dependents. And it's 65
So,
for the second year and 7,500 for the third year and beyond. So it kind of graduates up a little bit, but it's not a lot of money.
5, 6, 7,000 towards, as we mentioned, UC Berkeley at 50,000 is still a drop in the bucket, towards the process, but not something to be overlooked as a tool if you're heading down this path.
Right. And those federal student loans for under the once the student takes on, they do have income-based repayment options. Public service loan forgiveness for right now is still out there. It's written to the promissory notes. So those have the most options for repayment is
Okay.
the student loans. Yeah.
So if I, as a student in my name, if it's, I leave with $30,000 of total debt, that debt as a component of the potential total, if I had to borrow the entire amount of 200, may have the most flexibility in terms, needs-based or income-based, because we see this all the time. Somebody goes through and gets a wonderful education that costs $400,000 to be a teacher to make 50, right? It's just how do you dig out from under the size and shape of some of these numbers becomes really challenging. So other terms, is it just federal loan? How else are these described so as people come across them, they know what that is?
So the federal for the student borrower, the federal loans are going to be the first line because they don't have credit requirements, which
Sure.
is a whole other story. And then there will be private loans available, but they're based on credit. And so some will qualify and some will not qualify, usually higher interest rates. The downside with those are that there are no repayment options. Usually it's here's the payment, you can't make it, we'll garnish your wages for
Right.
the private ones. And then we start getting into the parent, what's the next line item, your financial assistance on there. And those are usually federal first are the parent plus loans. They're
Okay.
graduate loans, but they're federal and they are up to $20,000 per year is usually what parent plus and graduate level loans are at. They are not in the student's name. The student is even a co-signer on them. It
Oh,
is the parent's loan. And there aren't as many repayment options for income and that kind of thing on those as well.
okay. When you and I talk about this process is as somebody is coming to you with a mountain of debt and they're trying to figure out what are the systems that are available to help me address this debt, and these sort of college pieces are part of this.
Mhm.
Is there a difference between sort of federal parent plus versus the federal student loan in terms of what's dischargeable in bankruptcy if you get to the point where it really just isn't going to function?
There isn't much of a difference between the two as what's dischargeable. Right now, we have the ability to discharge student loans if we show a hardship. There's an attestation process now. However, anyone who has any significant retirement assets or a house with equity is likely not going to qualify for a discharge of student loans in bankruptcy.
So
So when
this
there's
is
a
that
debt
challenge
cap.
with the parent plus loan. If the parent takes it out and they're building for their own retirement, they own a home, they're accumulating retirement assets, there's very little that's going to be available to them to discharge that debt that they took on if something goes sideways in their life.
Correct. And the other side of it is bankruptcy can hold off collections. We can put somebody into a chapter 13 and hold off collections on a student loan if needed, but it's not ideal situation. Many times people are doing bankruptcy to get rid of the other debt that can be discharged in bankruptcy so they can try to pay back the student loans afterwards. So,
Got
yeah.
it. Because that seemed to be one of the big things that in the college debt problem, because of the limit credit capacity, the lenders were protected in, to avoid discharging the debts,
Mhm.
they'd be more willing to loan for college. So some of the debts are very, very hard to discharge in the normal bankruptcy process. Is that what you're still seeing today?
Yeah. It's that still is if you have a job and you have assets, it'd be very difficult to discharge student loans that were for the benefit of you or your dependent. Now, if you co-signed a student loan for someone else and you didn't get a benefit from that education, that is actually dischargeable in bankruptcy. And a lot of people don't realize that. So,
Okay. So still more flexibility to consult an expert if debt is part of this process, understanding, is it my debt? Is it the student's debt? That's one of the first questions
yep,
that you really need to understand. In this particular product that I'm looking at, who's the borrower or co-borrower on
correct.
that product?
Yep.
Um,
And then besides federal, there's the private student loans that parents
okay.
can also take on, which is just like any kind of credit instrument, except they also don't qualify for dischargeability, even though they're private. And so if it is a student loan product, you're going to have the same issues with dischargeability. Whereas if you put it on a credit card, you technically could probably discharge it in bankruptcy if you used a credit card to do it.
I'm not sure the financial advisor in me likes the idea of college on a credit card, but I could appreciate the difference as an
Right.
explanation. I definitely have, we've had those clients that are playing the 0%,
Yep.
changeroo to try to, spread those things out in the large balances.
Mm-hmm.
But that's interesting as a comparison, right? If it is a consumer-based debt program like a credit card, it has
Mm-hmm.
a different set of rules than this college and education-based debt programs.
Yep. And that's usually why I see that the private student loans that the parent takes out is the very bottom of the barrel when it comes to options, because there's no flexibility with them and they're very difficult to get rid of. So yeah.
Okay. So as we think through, just to make sure that I'm tracking, so we have the first one, kid's the borrower, or the student is the borrower. Good news is the student is the borrower and not the parent, right? The student is potentially voluntarily choosing. I understand I'm taking on this debt. I'm now more engaged in the process. I'm thinking about the risk and return associated with this investment. Maybe there's some communication to, even if you had the resources, expose them to this process to make sure that they're serious about this approach. Beyond, again, limited, it's going to take some resources to go beyond that. Beyond that, now we're talking about, who is the borrower, parent versus student, and whether it's a federal loan still or whether we're in the private marketplace. Am
Yep.
I tracking sort of the matrix of options here?
Yep. Those are all things that you should know before signing any dotted lines. Yes.
And is it clear to the borrower that this is a federal loan versus, hey, this is the Federal Home Loan Bank and it sounds like a federal loan, but isn't really?
It should be clear. You'll see direct and subsidized and unsubsidized is the language you'll see in
Okay.
the loans for federal loans.
So the
But
keywords direct, subsidized, and unsubsidized.
yep,
And those terms are associated with the federal loans and not the
yeah,
private.
correct.
Okay. So if I'm looking at financing options alongside a client and I'm seeing direct, subsidized, and unsubsidized, parent plus in particular, those keywords would suggest we're talking about federal loans and not private loans.
Correct.
Private
Yep.
loans would really just be talking about the college educational expense and who the borrowers are. And then we're into traditional debt terms and conditions.
Yes, that's correct. And you want to be really careful with the private ones because sometimes, like you said, they sound like federal. Everyone thinks like Sally Mae or Navient are federal, and they have both. They service federal loans, but they also offer their own private. And that's why you want to look at the actual note itself to see if it's a direct subsidized or unsubsidized loan.
How, how common is it that, you've taken out a loan and you haven't read the terms and conditions and really understood the details of the loan? Is it relatively understandable what you're borrowing and what the terms are?
I would argue that it's probably not. I don't think a lot of people read the terms. And a lot of the misconception I see around even federal or private is, when does repayment start? Does it start
Okay.
after graduation? Does it start
Sure.
within right away? Because sometimes the parent ones are right away.
Oh,
So analyzing those terms and the interest rate and those kinds of things are really important. And then what happens if you default? That'll be in the note of what happens if you default. And if
that
it
will be in the
says,
contract or the note of the
yes,
agreement that you're signing.
yes. And if it says, we send out someone to break your knees, that would be a red flag.
Yeah, is that Guido will visit you at home? Not to pick on,
Right,
I could have picked any name. I could have said John is going to show up at your
right.
home and encourage you strongly with, physical interaction to come up with the sources of repayment.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah.
that's
So
funny.
read those things. But yeah. And then the one other debt, sorry, my microphone was malfunctioning. One other, you mentioned HELOC. And that isn't a student loan, it's a consumer debt usually.
Sure.
And it can be a good option with the caveat that it is secured against your residence. It's secured
Sure.
against your house.
Yep.
And so if you don't make the payment on it, you lose your house. And that may not be the best idea.
Right, this is part of the problem, right? All of a sudden you have a mortgage and a HELOC, you default on the HELOC, they still get to foreclose on the entire house. That's the risk that a small piece of the debt triggers a larger transaction that you hadn't planned on. The other
Exactly.
thing that I think surprises some people is because it's a HELOC and they're used to their mortgage debt and their home-based debt being deductible, checking with tax counsel may uncover that it's unlikely that that interest would be deductible on your tax return because it's not being put towards acquisition debt associated with the primary residence. So if you're
Exactly.
taking a home equity line of credit to fund something that's not an upgrade or a purchase of your home, most tax counsel would suggest that that interest is not tax deductible. So you really are comparing interest rates apples to apples at that point. If your HELOC is 7% and your private loan is 8%, those are relatively close. You can't say that the 7% is deductible on the HELOC.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's something a lot of people don't realize is if you don't use it for improvement or investment in a house, it's not a deductible expense.
Yeah, important to review with your,
Yep.
tax or financial advisor on the deductibility of the home interest deduction and the amounts. Now the world has changed and how much you can deduct and things like that. So to go back to terms and conditions, it sounds like there's a bunch of confusion here on, when repayment needs to start. So let's go back to the top. If I, as the student, borrow 7,500, do I start typically paying that back right away? So
No, it's
federal loans for the student, those typically are delayed.
yes, it's usually 6 months after graduation or last enrollment. So if someone doesn't finish, is when the repayment starts for student.
The repayment process starts. And again, as we talked about, these are the types of programs that may have income-based or more flexibility in terms of repayment terms. Is that also true in terms of the federal parent loans, that those payments don't start until after graduation?
Usually, yes. So usually it's the same 6 months and after either graduation or last enrollment. And then there are fewer repayment options with the Parent Plus loans. Yeah.
Okay. And then into the private marketplace, we've got the federal, the direct, the subsidized, the unsubsidized, the federal programs, the private bucket could be just like credit card, HELOC. You borrowed it, you got your money. Hey, congratulations. You get to now enjoy sending us money on a regular basis immediately. It could be
Yep.
an immediate repayment process.
It could be. And then real quick on the terms for the subsidized and unsubsidized, what those words mean is the subsidized portion of the direct federal loans means your interest does not accrue while your student or you are the student is in school. Unsubsidized means interest is accruing while
It's just
in
not
school.
required
Yeah,
to be made.
it's not required to be paid. So your balance is going up, even though you borrowed $20,000. The balance is going to be higher than that when you actually graduate.
By
So
the time you graduate, it could be you borrowed 20, but they compounded the interest or added the interest to your outstanding balance. So it's 25 when you actually get started. So yes, you enjoyed the benefit of the deferral of that interest, but it's not really a benefit. It's still adding to the balance that you're going to owe at the end.
exactly. Yep.
Okay. All right. So in preference, we would like the subsidized as much as we can if we're going to tap the marketplace from an interest rate standpoint. Unsubsidized would be, helpful, but considering, yes, the payments are delayed, but the interest is going to get added to. So being aware of the total financial effect of the investment in this education that you're making.
Exactly. Yeah. And
Okay.
and subsidized is capped. It's about half for the student of what they can borrow is subsidized usually. So it is capped.
Okay. Okay. Super helpful. So then into the private loans, that's where we are starting to see things where payments would start sooner, being aware of or reading or understanding in more detail. What is the duration?
Yep.
How is that loan going to be that loan payment going to be calculated? What else surprises people in the terms associated with their private loans?
I think some of it too is the default, what a private student loan can do upon default. And for normal credit products, you have to go through a court and get a judgment, and collections take a long time. But private student loans still tend to fall under the student loan regulations, and they can just start garnishing wages a lot
Wow.
sooner than if they had to go through the whole court process for it. And so checking to see default terms is really important. And it's not so much that you're looking to, you're planning on defaulting, I guess, is what I want to say, but just so that you know what happens if you do.
Right. Well, and I think, for all of us, your practice is populated not by people who intended to declare bankruptcy, but life is surprising, right? And not always in positive ways. And health issues, changes in employment, changes in careers, bad things happen to good people to put them in a situation where their obligations outstripped their capacity to service them. And at some point, they just got buried underneath. And so being prudent to understand, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I should at least be aware, worst case, what happens in this particular instance. God forbid something happens and I can't complete and I'm not making more and I'm dealing with this creditor in some other fashion. Important to understand the terms and conditions of the products that are available. When
Exactly.
when
Planning
a
for worst.
Yeah, planning for worst case. When a student and their parent team or their guardian team or whoever the student has around them to help them through this process, when they're interacting with the educational institution, hey, you got in, congratulations, here's the bill, how do you want to pay? What are the educational institutions providing in terms of support to understand this universe and make connections or referrals or point out options to help facilitate this process?
In my experience, they don't really facilitate or provide that many resources. They hand the packet and say, here's where you should sign. And if you want to do something besides what we've put into your financial aid package, then it's up to you to kind of work through that. There are, I think some of the smaller schools sometimes are better at helping you find those programs that are available. But in my experience, that's just here's your package and do you want to sign on the dotted line?
Okay. Well, and I still go back to, the financial aid package, including a loan, is not really aid. That's just packaging up a debt that I'm going to loan to you that I still profit from. I just, anyway. So to go back to that, it's curious at this stage, I'm imagining like I did in interacting with the institutions alongside my student and my clients starting to do the same. It's bringing back this idea of some of the concepts in the alternative bucket. Are you finding that you know, more and more institutions are willing to negotiate or discount or find grants as people push back? Is that even an option anymore?
I would always say ask. It's always going to be no unless you go and ask. And
Sure.
I did that with law school. I went back and said, hey, another school offered me a scholarship. And they're like, well, I was trying to get into a reach school. And even my reach school gave me scholarship money after I went and said, hey, another school is going to offer me. It
Okay.
wasn't a
So,
lot of money, but it was enough.
but it
Um,
was, it was a piece and it wouldn't have been there if you hadn't asked.
exactly. And so everything's negotiable in life.
And
Um,
then you had data to back it up, right? You had alternatives or school names or something else to bring to the conversation. It wasn't just, hey, what are you offering in discounts? It's, hey, I really want to go here. Thanks for giving me the yes. However, as I'm now comparing the risk adjusted, cost adjusted difference, I'm not sure I really can tell at this point, except yours is $20,000 more than option B. Is there anything you can do to help me bridge that gap?
yes. Yep.
Okay. Okay, so that's back into the alternative bucket, your negotiating skill, depending on the nature of the institution. I think we're finding in our practices that some of the smaller schools are more responsive, the private schools, where some of the larger publics in particular, it's so impacted that they're, look, you got in, say thanks. We don't have anything else for you. Uh,
Yes. Yep.
okay, okay, good.
Mhm.
Um, so alternative bucket, federal, in the federal, student versus parent, subsidized versus unsubsidized or direct. And then we have this universe of private. Is there any way, if somebody's going to tap the full continuum of all the resources that they're going to need, that they're really just, they have the best kid ever, they're not going there to study, you know, social, aspects of what it means to be a 18, 19, 20-year-old. They're really focused on accomplishing them, and we're really trying to launch them into something valuable. I'm going to use the full continuum, and I may have to wander into this private space. Is there a useful way to try to find a good private lender in the universe of this murky underworld of, tough components?
I would, if you are credit worthy, I wouldn't necessarily require that it be a private student loan. If you can get just a line of credit, sometimes that is a better option. And often I'm looking for a term type loan, not a revolving debt type loan. So you want something that's a 5 or 10-year repayment plan.
Okay.
And
So
so
like
there isn't,
credit unions and banks will offer a personal line of credit up
yeah,
to some capacity. It's not a HELOC. It's like a fixed credit card where I'm advancing you cash. It's 10 or 12% to put against it. And it's really just a personal line of credit kind of tool.
yes. And
Okay.
those can be much more flexible and able to deal with and lower interest rates sometimes and not have the private loan. But you definitely want to look and see. There's not like this great list out there of
Right.
www something that has the
Right.
perfect list of everything. So you have to continuously do research
Right.
or have a professional who's doing the research for you. I'm a big fan of using professionals for the things that they're good at, that I don't
Sure.
have to go look things up. But yeah,
Okay.
use professionals. Yeah.
Okay. Good. That's helpful. Um, what of the you know, in this universe of alternative, debt-based, and other things, back to the alternative side for a second,
Mhm.
it really seemed challenging or hard to understand how do you find grants or scholarships? Are there ways to think about how to look for or search for or find grants or scholarships or tools like that?
And I think yes, I think it's gotten easier with the internet. I think when I was going to undergrad, it wasn't as a big of a thing to have the internet. But often you're looking at unique characteristics, either an interest that the student has, maybe your ancestry. A lot of them are based on, if you're Irish or German or from a certain area. And so a lot of times the more unique things that you come up with, the more option you have to actually qualify for something like that. And then if you have special, if your student has special skills, musical, it doesn't have to be sports. You don't have to get on a sports scholarship somewhere, but it could be a type of musical instrument. It could be a language they speak. It could be all kinds of different things. If they have a special interest, use that to see what's out there for grants and scholarships. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it can feel like even the local, Elks Club Lodge $1,000 scholarship feels like a drop in the bucket in a thunderstorm worth of cost. But, to the family, adjusted for the alternative, that's $10,000, $20,000 of otherwise value that be in an investment account somewhere else if I didn't have to spend it, right? So
Exactly.
even these little sips of deposits against what seems like an overwhelmingly large number, knitting these things together can really be powerful.
Exactly. And don't downplay something because it's a smaller amount. You can piecemeal those together. Yeah.
Right. Every bit helps in the, pursuing this as a valuable process and experiencing the effort and the challenge to find it from a size and shape standpoint, engaging the whole family.
Yes, and especially if you look at it as a financial advisor, where the time value of money, or if you kept that $1,000 in your bank account for the next 15 to 20 years,
Right.
what that would do instead of the $1,000. I mean, it's a huge, if you run
It's
the
a big
projections
difference.
on it. Yeah.
This is the big difference. This is back to the top why when you start looking at $200,000 that a guardian or family is going to sacrifice from saving for retirement to investing in this education, that $200,000 for them is otherwise nearly north of $1 million for their own retirement, given the common age of when these adults are making these decisions alongside their charges. That's a big trade-off, right? That's years of retirement income and security. And again, this is back to, these challenging stories where I graduated from Columbia with $800,000 of debt to become a public school teacher making 30, right? It just super challenging. Yes, you got through the process. Your education is wonderful. And the return on investment there is very, very tough to parse out from a value standpoint. And we're layering this on human beings at a time when it's unclear what my path should be and how I should be pointed and where my best, skills role match would be. And taking on this expense can be challenging to really decide, is it worth it or not from a value perspective?
And that's a really good point, that something I try to bring up a lot of times with people looking at debt and things like is talk to the student. They should know what the ROI is and what their projected salary is going to be with their job, and talk them through the numbers. And if you don't know how to do that, then you call John to have him walk you through, like, if I make $50,000 a year, what's my minimum payment on $200,000 of debt? It's going to be $2,500 at least a month. And if you're making $50,000 a year, that's, 60% of your take home. So walking through that with students is key. Like, they need to understand before they decide on a school what that means for their long-term future.
Yeah, super helpful to talk through that math in terms of the size and shape of what that payment looks like, when that payment starts, what's available from a resource standpoint. And going back to goals and objectives, what are your goals and objectives for this effort? And really, especially for, our friends and neighbors that are in that space where there's capacity to help make this happen and the drive to make it happen because of the expectation of how positive the experience is going to be, without, the ability to step back and say, and sometimes a student is enhanced by experiencing some of the challenges associated with this process in some capacity and picking that, right? The lessons we learn the most tend to come from some of those hardest experiences, the job and this is I live in a big, huge, beautiful glass house, right? This is not an easy conversation for sure. But going back to the tools and resources, at least so far, what we've covered, the alternative bucket, there are still some places, and most parents are aware and they're working hard to try to track those down: grants, scholarships, work study, part-time job. invent something that's really famous and valuable so you can be a billionaire and pay for all the college you want, right?
Be a YouTuber.
Yeah,
Be a YouTuber.
be a YouTuber. In the debt space, it sounds like what we need to really be looking for and understanding, is it private or something else? That's the big deal. And then as best you can in order of priority, the parents for sure understanding who's the borrower. And if you are going to avail yourself of these tools, even if you have a private conversation, hey kid, you're going to get the student version of that. Even if I have to help you with it, I'm happy to do that on the side. But let's get that first before I'm on the hook for these pieces, or co-borrow or something like that. Because if I'm on the hook in an educational based piece, it's going to be very challenging for me. God forbid something happens to us as parents and we don't have the ability to repay. It's problematic. So I'm going to make you go first, and your conversation can be whether you help them with that piece or not, before you wade into the private spot, which makes it very challenging. And again, in the private spot, maybe we put the HELOC there, private line of credit, which again, private line of credit is not an education debt. So again, much more flexible in terms of being able to discharge if the world changes to that degree. So again, keywords that we learned to pay attention to: direct, subsidized, unsubsidized, parent plus. Those things stick out as the federal programs may have some advantages. Payments deferred, interest may accrue or not. So understand which product that you have. In the private world, really got to read the terms and conditions and who's going to show up on your door if you default. Because in the educational based loans, much easier for that lender to get after your resources than in other types of debt.
Yep, exactly.
Awesome. What other frequently asked questions do you get presented? And I'll go to the questions from the community here as well. So as the questions come in, we'll get those organized and try to answer them. What other questions do you see come up in your practice, or as people ask you, knowing your expertise in this area, that come up related to college?
And this may get slightly soapboxy, but I will often get, what can I do if I don't qualify for a private loan because of my credit, or something like, what can I do for my child?
Sure.
You can say no. There's that selection, I think, and we talked about this at the very beginning, but there's always the choice to go to the community college route or go to a less expensive option usually. And so oftentimes it's, I don't qualify for this. Sometimes students, even if they're dependents, can qualify for additional federal loans if you can show that your parent doesn't qualify for those parent plus loans. So keeping that in mind, that there's sometimes ways to work around things. Other questions I often get is, what if I took out student loans for my stepchild and now we're divorced and I'm still on the hook for the stepchild? And like, yes, that's the contract that you signed. You're still on the hook for those. Same thing with co-signing. If you co-sign a loan and something goes sideways with the person you co-signed with, still legally liable for that. And so those are a lot of the questions that come up on, can I get out of this type discussion? So yeah.
Yeah, again, back to sort of the headline issue that the college-oriented debt programs are much stickier and harder to discharge, regardless of what happens as a surprise. And we can throw in now challenges with the relationship associated with the humans that were otherwise responsible for the student. How does that process play out? And again, still sounds like a challenging situation where you're responsible for a debt for a student that you really don't feel responsible for anymore. Challenging. We got a question that came in, and I'm curious if you have a perspective. I haven't done the math, but is there any sense from your perspective in terms of interest rate or expenses associated with the different programs? Like, is the federal programs 7 and private is 8? And I mean, do you have a sense of what the interest rates are, how they run, and how they relate to each other?
So the federal loans tend to be in the 6 to 8% range. The laws keep changing, executive orders keep coming and going. It was knocked down to 2% at one point. And so generally the federal loans tend to be lower interest rate than private. So if you go private, it's going to be, like you said, in the 10 to 14% range right now with current interest rates. So they tend to be better interest rates for federal.
And do they tend to be floating rate or fixed? Like if I take out a loan today, is that tranche of debt that I've borrowed, is that fixed for the time period, or will it float at some point in the future?
It's fixed unless there's some kind of government change that says we're going to lower the interest rates on everything.
Wait, sometimes the government changes? That's so
Yes,
weird.
it's so frustrating with student loans these days because you can give advice one day and the next day there's something totally different going on.
Oh.
But if you consolidate loans, because some people do have
Mm.
multiple student loans out there and then you consolidate,
Yep.
it is pro rata. So you can't get a lower interest rate by consolidating. It's just merged together based on the interest rates for the underlying debt. So it's not
That's really that's a version 2 question of the seminar. That comes up a lot as the debt consolidation offers in the college loan process. Sounds like there's some restrictions and limitations on how you can easily package these together and consolidate them into a single payment.
right. And there's federal consolidation and there's private consolidation. Probably doing another rabbit hole there. But yes, it's one of the things to consider is it doesn't change your interest rate for federal consolidation.
Okay. So while today, I mean, our 10-year treasury might be at 4.5% or 5%. So if you're watching the recording, check your own interest rates at the time. But if the interest rates are relatively high and they're lower in the future, or maybe future tranches might be at a lower interest rate, but I'm going to get fixed for whatever piece I borrow will probably be fixed for that period of time,
Yep.
unless rules change, obviously.
Yep.
Awesome. Great. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in. So I want to say a big Summit thank you to our friend Jen Lee and her mascot Bernadette. Hopefully, we're never in that situation where we want to scrape our debts together and light them on fire. But we really appreciate your perspective. It's such an important and different and odd piece of the lending universe to talk through what are our tools and resources, how do these things all compare in real ways in a post, world if we're dealing with these debts and issues. So a big thank you to you for volunteering your time and helping our community build a resource that they can refer to. And we look forward to connecting out with everybody in the future.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.